Wipe them out, the Galactic Council ordered. The human heard it too soon. The translation bead inside my ear was so small that no one on that council floor had ever noticed it. I had worn it for 3 years. For 3 years, I had sat through hundreds of diplomatic sessions with that tiny device hidden inside my ear, listening to words no human was ever supposed to understand. And on the day they voted to end my species, I was sitting in the third row of the observer gallery with a glass of cold water in my hand when the bead whispered the verdict to me in plain English before the chief delegate even finished speaking. They gave us 40 cycles, roughly 4 Earth years, enough time to make our extinction look natural, reactor failures, crop collapse, atmosphere drift. A chain of disasters so clean and so well-planned that no one would ask too many questions. They had done it before. I already knew that before Delegate Heron of the Salari finished reading the motion aloud, because I'd spent 3 years in that chamber listening to things no human was meant to hear. That my name is Commander Siravast. I was 37 years old when the Galactic Council voted to eliminate the human race. And when it happened, I did not stand up. I did not speak. I did not let my face change at all. I took one slow sip of water. Then I set the glass back down with both hands perfectly steady. The chamber was beautiful that I will not pretend otherwise. 700 feet of curved amber crystal. 12 floating delegation platforms hanging at different heights like notes on a scale. Blue bioluminescent light spreading softly from living organisms in the ceiling, organisms older than human civilization itself. IT was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. IT was also the room where my species was just handed a death sentence. Delegate Heron kept speaking for 4 more minutes after the vote passed. The motion carried 10-2. Delegate Sue of the Ethany voted against it, along with one other delegate whose translation I could not fully catch. Heron thanked the council for its clarity. He thanked them for their courage. He used the word courage. I stored that word away, the same way I stored everything away in the part of my mind that never really stopped working. There were 6 other human observers in the gallery with me. None of them spoke Galactic Standard. None of them had translation beads. They were there for appearance, part of the council's polite little performance of openness after humanity had been invited into observer status 3 years earlier. None of them understood what had just happened. I looked at Lieutenant Warren Cole, sitting 2 seats to my left. He was watching the glowing ceiling with mild scientific curiosity that he had no idea. And I was not going to tell him that instead, I pressed my right thumb lightly against the inside of my left wrist. Anyone watching, it looked like a nervous habit. What it actually did was send a compressed signal along a frequency the council had never bothered scanning, because they did not believe human technology could do anything useful there. The signal contained 4 characters, just 4 data confirmation. Code. The vote had passed, and somewhere across council space, people who had been waiting years for that signal began to move. I stayed in my seat for another 30 minutes while the council went on with normal business. Trade matters, border disagreements, routine bureaucracy. The usual. I listened to all of it. I even made note of 2 separate agenda items that might become useful later. Then the session ended. The delegates stood. The blue light overhead dimmed slightly, as if the chamber itself was breathing out, and I rose with the others and walked out in a quiet, orderly line. Warren caught up with me in the corridor. He was all long legs and open curiosity, 26 years old, only 8 months in a diplomatic service, and still the kind of man who believed the council was fundamentally good. I had believed that once too. Anything interesting? He asked. Trade disputes, I said. Nothing you missed. He nodded and started talking about the ceiling organisms and whether they might be sentient. I let him talk. I answered at the right moments. But inside, I was already somewhere else, running numbers, building timelines, counting hours. How long before the council filed the first implementation order with enforcement? How long before the machinery of extinction officially began moving? Not long. But that was all right, because the truth was we had already done most of our work. That is the part the council never understood. They thought Directive Null 7 was the beginning of a process that IT was not at IT, was simply the signal that another process, one they knew nothing about, had now entered its final phase. That tiny wrist signal I sent from the gallery did not begin our response. The IT unlocked 11 years of preparation, 11 years of quiet work. Careful work, patient work, work done by people who had already given up parts of their lives so that when this day came, humanity would not be reacting, we would already be in position. The Council gave us 40 cycles to disappear. We had spent 11 years making sure 40 cycles would not be enough. The corridor outside the chamber smelled like recycled air and cold metal, the same way most stations smelled. Warren was still talking that I was already thinking about Dr. Claire Henning, living on the far side of council space among the breath. I was thinking about Oliver Page, who was at that very moment inside the Galactic Council's own financial system. And I was thinking about dozens of others like them. Quiet people, invisible people, ready people. I thought again about Heron using the word courage. I almost smiled. But the corridor cameras were council operated, so I kept my face come all the way back to the human quarters. Once inside my room, I closed the door, sat down on the edge of my bunk, and gave myself exactly 90 seconds to feel afraid. Not dramatic fear, not panic. The deeper kind, the kind that sits behind your ribs and makes breathing feel like work. I gave it 90 seconds. Then I stood up, opened my mission log, and got to work. They had given us 40 cycles. They had no idea what they had really given us time to finish. I should start with Oliver Page, because Oliver is the kind of person who makes you rethink what a quiet human being can actually do. He was 41 years old, from Bristol, and he liked doing crossword puzzles on paper because he said it kept his handwriting neat. He was not physically impressive. Average height, slightly soft around the middle, always losing his reading glasses and then finding them again 2 minutes later. He laughed easily. He remembered everything. And most importantly, he had the rare gift of being the sort of man people never looked at too carefully. For 6 years, Oliver had been living inside the Galactic Council's financial network. Not metaphorically. Literally, he had a real identity. A real office. A real desk. Real co-workers who waved to him in the corridor at Vera Station. Officially, he was a low-level data auditor hired through one contractor, who was hired through another contractor, who was hired through another. The paper trail went cold long before it got anywhere near Earth. He reviewed reconciliation reports. He flagged tiny mistakes. He attended meetings where almost nothing happened. To all appearances, he was one of the most forgettable men in council space. And for 6 straight years, he had been quietly reading everything. Oliver did not invent the plan. That came earlier, 11 years before the vote. A small group inside human intelligence looked at a series of intercepted signals and reached a conclusion that was as logical as it was terrifying. Humanity was growing too fast, that we were spreading too quickly, asking too many questions, showing up in too many places, and building relationships too easily. The Council had removed inconvenient species before, carefully, slowly, in ways that looked like accidents. And if humanity kept expanding the way it was, then sooner or later, we would become inconvenient. They built a program. Its name was the Long Patience. Its idea was simple. If the Council ever turned on humanity, then humanity would need to already be so deeply woven into council space, so informed, so connected, and so difficult to remove, that trying to destroy us would damage the whole structure around us, that we did not announce the program, that we did not explain it to the wider diplomatic corps. We selected people with unusual patience, unusual skill, and the ability to be boring on purpose. Then we sent them out under long cover identities and told them to build lives that know. One would question. Oliver was one of them. Claire Henning was another. When a vote passed, there were 31 people in the Long Patience network scattered across 14 council worlds and 7 stations. None of them carried weapons. None of them were soldiers in the usual sense. Their tools were access, information, and years of ordinary-looking relationships that no one thought to examine too closely. Y signal reached Oliver 11 minutes after the vote. He was eating lunch at his desk. While reviewing a shipping ledger with a minor error in column 47, he read the confirmation code, set down his fork, and opened a file he'd been building for 4 years. Inside that file were records of 17 irregular financial transactions routed through the Council's discretionary fund over 12 years. The transactions were not exactly illegal by Council law, but they were embarrassing, deeply embarrassing. And 3 of them connected directly to the Salari delegation, including Heron's office. Oliver did not send the file. Not yet. That was not the sequence. The first move was not exposure. The first move was position that he made 4 tiny changes to access permissions, the kind that looked like normal maintenance if anyone ever bothered checking. Those 4 changes opened a path into a part of the network he had been preparing to reach for 8 months. Then he set a timer, finished his lunch, waved at a colleague passing his office, and later that evening, he filed a completely ordinary reconciliation report with a very small hidden subroutine inside. ITNO security scanner looked for ITNO security scanner, even knew such a thing was possible to be. Why the time I was back in my quarters writing notes into my mission log, Oliver had already placed the first piece on the board. Now I need to tell you about Claire Henning, because Claire is the reason I still believe one of the most powerful things a person can do is make another person feel truly seen. Claire was a xenobiologist by training, which was why she was the obvious choice for the breath assignment that was also why the assignment almost broke her in the first year. The breath were the most physically intimidating species in Council space. 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in layered plating that served the same purpose skin serves for us. They communicated through subsonic vibration and exact body positioning, and it took Claire 14 months just to learn enough not to insult people by accident. But once he got past the fear of first contact, the breath were something else entirely. They were loyal, they were deeply communal, and they carried a cultural memory that reached back 40,000 years. They were also the species the Council depended on when it needed force. The Salari handled diplomacy. The Council itself provided legitimacy. But the breath provided strength. If Directive Null 7 was ever going to be enforced properly, the Council would need breath cooperation. Without them, orders would be much harder to carry out. So Claire spent 6 years becoming someone the breath trusted. She learned their language at a level many experts said a human body should not even be able to manage. To do that, she spent a miserable year working with medical specialists to change the way she produced subsonic tones. She studied breath medicine. She contributed research on cellular regeneration that turned out to be useful enough for the breath medical community to adopt. She sat with elders during memory recitation ceremonies, long ritual tellings of history that lasted for hours, and she listened with complete attention. And then she noticed something. There was a gap, a missing stretch in breath. History, roughly 30 years, around 800 Earth years earlier, that the elders always moved past with careful vagueness. Their cultural memory was detailed everywhere else, but not there. Whenever Claire gently asked about that period, the conversation shifted, always politely, always firmly. She spent 2 years tracing the silence. What she eventually found, hidden inside Council archive records that Oliver quietly helped her access, changed everything. 800 years earlier, the breath had been close to becoming an independent galactic power. They had been expanding, building alliances, growing into a real balance against Council authority. Then came a devastating internal conflict that pushed them back centuries and left them weak enough to depend on Council support. Except it had not actually been an internal conflict. It had been provoked, federal engineered. The Council's predecessor had created it using the same methods now planned against humanity. They had broken the breath from the inside and then stepped in afterward as the generous power helping them recover. And they had been collecting the political reward for that ever since. The breath did not know this. Their history had been cut, not by their own elders, not by tradition, by outside hands centuries ago. The missing truth had been removed so completely that the elders were not hiding anything. They were simply repeating the history they themselves had been left with. Y signal reached Claire through a relay, so indirect it looked like an ordinary academic update. She opened the file, saw the confirmation code in the header, then sat still for a long moment the way she always did before making an important decision. After that, she opened the historical case file she had spent 2 years building, checked everything one last time, and prepared it for delivery. Not yet. Only when the sequence reached that point. But she was ready. There were 29 others like Oliver and Claire, each with a piece of the plan, each waiting, each already in place. The Council had voted to eliminate humanity, They had no idea that for 11 years, humanity had already been living inside the walls of their house. There was another person you need to understand, because without him, the whole thing feels cleaner than it really was. His name was Peter Aldridge. He was 29 years old, from a small town in New Zealand that he talked about constantly, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and the sky feels bigger than it should. Peter was a communications technician, not flashy, not high-ranking, not someone anyone would notice in a room full of important people, which is exactly why he was chosen. He had been embedded on a council relay station for 3 years when something went wrong. Not a failure, not a mistake. Something worse, that he was too perfect. The council's internal security division ran routine scans sometimes. Wide, unfocused sweeps meant more to reassure themselves than to catch anything real. But Peter's signal patterns were too clean, too controlled, too precise. The absence of noise became its own kind of noise. The system flagged him that a human signal profile that didn't behave like a human signal profile, that a security officer looked at it. Then another. And then everything started moving in the wrong direction. That we lost Peter 8 years before the council vote. That we lost another operative, Diane Ford, 6 months later when the council tightened its screening protocols after whatever they thought they had discovered. They did not understand what they had found. They did not discover the long patience. They thought they had caught 2 independent data thieves, small, unimportant, replaceable. They were wrong. Peter and Diane never told them anything. They went through interrogation, pressure, isolation, and they gave nothing. Eventually, the council decided there was no larger network and deeper threat. They moved both of them to a detention facility on the outer rim. Alive, contained, forgotten that we knew they were alive, because the long patients had eyes there too, and from the very beginning, their extraction had been part of the plan. Not immediate, not reckless, but scheduled. Carefully the right moment. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something clearly. This was not a perfect plan. It was not clean. It was not painless. It was 11 years of people living double lives in places they did not belong, carrying secrets that would have destroyed them if exposed, and doing it for a species that did not even know they existed. Peter gave 8 years of his life. Diane gave 6, and they never broke. I carried that with me every single day. 2 days after the vote, the council held a formal diplomatic reception, the kind of event where everyone pretends nothing serious has happened, where people smile, talk, drink, where politics hides behind polite conversation. All observer delegations were invited. I went. I wore the correct uniform. I stood in the right places. I ate food I could not taste. And I spoke calmly with beings who had just ordered my species erased. Delegate Heron spoke to me for 4 minutes near the drink station. He smiled, complimented humanity's curiosity, said he hoped our relationship with the council would continue to grow. I thanked him, politely, carefully, and meant none of it, because while that conversation was happening, the sequence was already moving. Oliver was in position. Claire was ready. 29 others were waiting, and inside the council's own systems, something had already begun to grow. A small, hidden subroutine, quiet, patient, learning the structure of the network, understanding permissions, mapping connections. IT had been designed over years, prepared over time, and now, finally, it was awake. That night I went back to my quarters and checked the mission board. Everything was green, every piece exactly where it needed to be. The council believed Directive Null 7 was a 40-cycle plan. They believed they had time. They did not. I sat at my desk and looked out at the stars through the small window above my bunk, and I thought about all the people out there, invisible, unrecognized, doing work that history might never fully record. I thought about Peter. I thought about Diane. And like I always did, I opened my mission log and wrote their names at the top of the page. Every time. IT was not enough. But it was something. 3 days later, the first disaster happened. Kepler's reached out a human colony on the edge of council space. About 400,000 people living in dome settlements on a harsh but resource-rich world. The council had chosen it as the first target, small enough to manage, far enough away to avoid attention. Their plan was clean. A reactor cascade. A failure that would look natural. Total destruction. No survivors. By all technical standards, it was a perfect plan. There was only one problem. The colony was emptied 72 hours before the Council strike. Kepler's Reach had been evacuated. Quietly, completely. The official reason was a seismic warning, unstable ground, possible underground movement. The warning came from a human geological agency, an agency that did not really exist. IT had been created 18 months earlier for exactly this purpose. The people of Kepler's Reach were confused, some were frustrated, but they followed the evacuation orders. They moved to transit stations, temporary housing, safe zones. When the Council's system triggered the reactor collapse, there was no one left to die. The settlement burned, collapsed, disappeared, and the Council recorded it as a success. On Vera Station, we received the news as a tragedy. Reactor failure. Total loss. No survivors. Warren sat down hard when I told him. His face went pale. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the floor. After a long silence, he stood up and left quickly, saying he felt sick that I stayed where I was, sitting with a lie I could not correct yet, because the truth would come. But not yet. Not until the sequence reached the point where truth would do more good than harm. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. I received a message that IT was from Delegate Sue of the Ethany. Officially, it was a formal condolence message about the loss of Kepler's Reach. Routine, expected, but it was longer than it. Should have been 12 words longer, and those extra words formed a pattern, hidden in the structure, written in an old Ethany dialect. A phrase. I voted no. I will speak if you will. I read it once, then again. Then I ran it through every check I had that IT was real. The message was real, which meant one thing. Someone inside the Council was reaching out. The question was simple. Was it genuine? Or was it a trap? I did not answer immediately. I spent a full day thinking about it. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Carefully. The way you learn to think when one wrong move can end everything. If it was a trap, what would the Council gain? They would confirm that I understood Galactic Standard, that I had a translation bead, that I knew what had really been said during the vote. Useful information, but not critical. The vote had already happened. The sequence was already in motion. Knowing I understood would not stop what we had already started. But if it was real, if Sue was genuine and I ignored it, then we would lose something far more valuable. Access, insight at a voice inside the Council that might not agree with what was happening. I looked at the message again. Not the words, the method. Old Ethany dialect. A language few people studied deeply. A complicated choice. Too complicated for a simple trap. Anyone setting a trap would choose something easier, something faster, something more obvious. But this message was precise, careful, designed to be understood only by someone who was already paying very close attention. That mattered. I made my decision. I replied that I in the same formal diplomatic structure, polite, neutral, exactly what protocol required, but I added 11 extra words, and inside those extra words, hidden in the structure, was a single Ethany character. IT meant one thing. Yes. 2 days later, we met. Officially, it was a discussion about cultural exchange programs. That is what the room logs would show. That is what anyone reviewing the records would see. But both of us knew that was not why we were there. SU was not what I expected. I in public, Sue was controlled. Careful. Formal. I in private. With no one else in the room, Sue was direct. Almost painfully honest. The kind of honesty that costs something to maintain. The Ethany were long-lived, slow to make decisions. But once they reached a conclusion, they did not move easily. SU had served on the Council for decades. And when Sue spoke, it was clear this was not a sudden reaction. This was something that had been building for a long time. The Council is afraid, Sue said. Not political fear. Not cautious fear, something deeper. Something instinctive. Humanity expanded too fast that we adapted too easily we built connections across species lines without hesitation, without hierarchy, without distance, and that unsettled them. Because the Council's entire system depended on control, on structure, on keeping species in defined positions. And humanity did not follow those rules, not intentionally, not aggressively, we simply ignored them. And that made us dangerous. You are not the first species they have decided to remove, Sue said. I know. I answered, as you studied me carefully. Then asked the question I had been expecting. How much do you know? I did not tell everything. That would have been reckless, but I told enough to make it clear that humanity had been preparing, that we were not blind, that we were not unready, and that the long patience existed, that I did not give names, that I did not give locations, but I gave the shape of the truth. Su listened without moving. Completely still, the kind of stillness that means someone is paying attention to everything, not just what is being said, but what is not being said. When I finished, Sue asked one simple question. What do you need from me? I shook my head. Nothing yet, I said. When the time comes, I will tell you. Until then, do nothing different. Act normally. Vote normally. Sue nodded. In hesitation, in argument, that we spent the next 20 minutes talking about actual cultural exchange programs because the room was almost certainly being monitored. Then we left separately, and I went back to my quarters, and I sat for a long time thinking about something very specific. The kind of courage it takes to say no in a room where everyone else says yes. That kind of courage mattered. More than strength. More than power. It was the same kind of courage Peter had shown. The same kind Diane had shown. The same kind every person in the long patience had shown every single day for years. That I opened my mission log that I was not supposed to record contact like this. But I wrote 3 words anyway. Sue voted no. Then I closed the log and waited because the sequence was still moving and timing mattered more than anything else. While I sat there, Oliver was still in his office, still reviewing reports, still looking completely ordinary, and the subroutine he had planted was growing. Mapping the financial network, understanding its structure, quietly expanding its reach. While I sat there, Claire was with the breath, participating in their rituals, waiting, because she knew exactly when her moment would come. Point 3. Days later, the council issued a second directive, another colony. Larger, closer to central space. They expected it to take longer. They expected resistance. They expected difficulty. They were wronged. We had already been there. 2 weeks earlier, a human inspection team had visited that colony. Officially, it was a routine agricultural check. In reality, it was 3 long patience operatives. They spent 4 days briefing the colony leadership, quietly, carefully, teaching them a new emergency protocol. The colony thought it was a safety measure. It was not. That it was an evacuation plan. Precise, fast, effective. I sent the activation signal the same day the council issued the directive. Within hours, the colony began emptying in panic and chaos. Just quiet movement. People leaving in waves, following instructions they believed were routine. By the time the council systems reached the colony, there was no one left. Another success. Another empty victory. And that same night, Warren knocked on my door. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. Then he sat down across from me. Very still, very quiet. Something is wrong, he said. That he was young, inexperienced, but he was not stupid. He had been watching, thinking, counting. The numbers did not make sense to him. The disasters were too clean, too consistent, too controlled. That I looked at him for a moment. Then I said one thing. Close the door. And then I told him, not everything, but enough for him to understand what was really happening. Warren did not interrupt. He did not panic. He just listened. And when I finished, he sat there for a long moment, processing it all. How long? He asked. 11 years, I said. He nodded slowly. And you knew, when the vote happened? I heard it as it happened. Another pause. Then he asked the most important question. What do we do now? I gave him the only answer that mattered. We wait. He looked at me, confused at first. Then slowly he understood, because waiting is the hardest part. Waiting when you already know what is coming. Waiting when everything inside you wants to act, but the plan is already moving, and acting too early would break it. He nodded. Then he asked about Kepler's reach. That I told him the truth. Everyone was alive. He let out a breath he had been holding for days. Then he straightened slightly. Focused. What can I do? He asked. That was the moment I knew he would be. Find out. I gave him a task. Small. Simple. Monitor the council's public channels. Watch for patterns. Look for timing signals. That IT was not the most important job, but it was the right one for him. And he took it seriously. 3 days later, he found something I had not told him to look for. Something important. Warren Cole was learning fast. And the sequence was moving toward its midpoint. On a quiet morning, while I was eating breakfast, while Oliver was filing another routine report, while Claire was finishing a research update, the subroutine completed its work, the entire financial network mapped, understood, ready. A single confirmation signal came through, short, simple, final, that we were ready for the next step. I put down my fork, stood up, looked out at the stars for exactly 1 second, and went to work, because what came next was the moment everything changed. The council called it a closed session. Emergency leveled at no observers allowed. Only core delegates and essential staff. Officially, the purpose was simple. To approve the next phase of Directive Null 7, the part where they would stop targeting small colonies and start targeting Earth-level populations, worlds that could not be erased quietly, worlds that would require force, risk, visibility. But they believed they had control. They believed the first 2 phases had worked perfectly. Point 2 colonies. Destroyed. No survivors. No resistance. No suspicion. They believed this because their reports said so, because their systems confirmed it, because it had never occurred to them that humanity might have known. They did not know about the long patience. They did not know about Oliver. They did not know about Claire. They did not know about the others. They did not know they had been watched for 11 years. The chamber sealed. Encryption activated. External signals allowed. Private, secure control. That is what they thought. 12 minutes into the session, I sent a signal. Just one. Simple, precise. The kind of signal you do not notice unless you are waiting for it. Far above the chamber floor, inside the living structure of the ceiling, something woke up. 8 months before the vote, a human operative named Grace Fuller had been assigned to maintenance duty in that very chamber. Her job had been simple. Maintain the bioluminescent organisms. Keep the system stable. Be invisible. She had done that job perfectly every day for 4 months. And while she worked, she built something else, something small, something biological, something no scanner would ever question. A second broadcast node, hidden inside living tissue, connected but not connected, silent until now. When my signal reached it, it began to transmit, not by breaking encryption, not by hacking systems, something cleaner, something smarter. IT used diplomatic keys, real ones, keys that had been collected over years through normal legal exchange. The node did not force its way out. IT spoke as if it already belonged. And across the galaxy, 34 neutral governments received a message. A secure diplomatic transmission from the Galactic Council chamber. Live, unfiltered, undetected. 34 governments started listening, and what they heard changed everything. They heard the council discussing extinction, calmly, methodically, like it was paperwork. They heard timelines, methods, execution strategies. They heard words like containment, removal, stability. And then they heard something worse. Heron spoke, and in one moment of open discussion, he said something that, when translated correctly, meant this: that controlling species populations was simply part of governance, normal, necessary, routine. That alone would have been enough. But we did not stop there, because this was never just about exposure. IT was about proof. Attached to that live broadcast was a data package. Everything Oliver had been building for 6 years. 17 financial transactions, carefully hidden, quietly routed, connecting council funds to operations that were never meant to be seen. 6 species, over 200 years, each one destroyed by natural disasters, each one preceded by private council discussions, each one matching the exact pattern of Directive Null 7. IT was all there, documented, organized, impossible to deny. And then came the final piece, the breath, because while 34 governments were listening, Claire Henning was standing in front of someone who mattered more than all of them. Commander veteran, leader of the Breath military, a being who had known her for 4 years, trusted her, respected her, believed in her. Claire did not speak at first. She simply placed the data case on the table and waited. Veteran opened it, read the first section, then looked up, and for 2 hours Claire answered every question, clearly, directly, without hesitation. She showed him everything. The missing history, the engineered conflict, the truth the Breath had never been allowed to know. At the end of those 2 hours, Veteran stood, fully upright. Every plate aligned at a breath sign of final decision. And then he said one thing: "We will respond." 4 hours later, the galaxy heard that response. The Breath Military Command issued a broadcast. Public, clear, unmistakable. They were withdrawing all support from the Galactic Council. Immediately, they stated they had received evidence of manipulation, historical control, engineered conflict. They declared humanity a protected species, and they called on every other civilization to review the evidence. Within 6 hours, 3 more species followed. Then more, because now it was no longer just a secret that IT was visible, public, undeniable. The Council's closed session had lasted less than 3 hours. When the delegates walked out of that chamber, they walked into a galaxy that had already heard everything and had already started choosing sides. Heron was told in the corridor. Warren saw it happen. He told me later. Heron stood completely still, longer than anyone had ever seen him still. Then he asked for the report again. Then again. Then nothing, and oh speech, and oh reaction. Just silence for 90 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the chamber. Warren walked the other way and sent me one word: working. YES, that IT was working. Everything was working. SU contacted me almost immediately. They know the session was exposed, Sue said. They're trying to find out how. What do you need from me? This was the moment. Call the assembly, I said at a pause. That body hasn't met in over a century. I know. They will know it was me. Yes. Silence. Then, give me 40 minutes. It took 35. The pre-council interspecies assembly, an older authority the council had buried over time, was suddenly active again. Notifications went out. 61 species received it. 44 confirmed attendance within 2 hours. The council could not stop it because they had never truly replaced it, only ignored it. And now, it was back, louder than ever. The council was not destroyed. Not yet. But it had lost control. That IT had lost the room. And in a system built entirely on control, that was the beginning of the end. I sat in my quarters listening to everything at once. Warren's updates, Sue's messages, public broadcasts. And I thought about that moment when I pressed my thumb to my wrist. 4 characters, 11 years of work. 31 people. Peter, Diane, Grace, Oliver, Claire, all of it leading to this. The council had tried to erase humanity. Instead, they had exposed themselves. Not with weapons, not with war, but with information, timing, patience. I let myself feel it for 90 seconds. Then I opened the mission board again, because one thing was left. Peter and Diane. 6 hours, that was all it would take. And this time, they were coming home. 6 months later, I was standing in the same chamber. The same amber crystal walls, the same blue light from the living ceiling. The same quiet hum of a station that had existed longer than human history. IT looked exactly the same. But everything had changed. The platforms were different now. There were more of them, and they were no longer stacked in layers of power, and one stood above anyone else. They formed a wide arc equal. 41 species, and more joining every week. The Galactic Council still existed, technically, but it was no longer in control. Something new had replaced it. They called it the Interspecies Compact. The name did not come from humans. That IT came from the breath, which felt right. They had lost the most. And when they learned the truth, they had moved the fastest. Commander Veteran's voice had carried across the galaxy in those first days. Clear, final, unshakable. And people had listened. I stood on the main floor, not on a platform. Humanity did not take a leading position. We refused it every time it was offered. Because this was never about replacing one dominant power with another. IT was about making sure no single species could ever control the rest again. That mattered more than recognition, more than authority, more than power. The compact charter was being signed. 41 representatives, 1 by 1. SU stood at the front, holding a physical pen, not digital, not symbolic, real, because the old assembly, the one the council had ignored for centuries, had always signed agreements by hand, and some traditions are worth keeping. The pen moved across the surface with a soft sound, almost like a quiet bell. Each signature followed. 1 after another, and when the last one was complete, something happened that a sound filled the chamber. Low, deep, felt more than heard in old Ethany tone. Used to mark the beginning of a new ER. T lasted about 30 seconds, and O1 spoke, and O1 moved. Because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. Something had ended, and something else had begun. Warren stood beside me. He was crying, trying not to, slightly embarrassed. But I said nothing because it was the right response. 6 months ago, he had understood nothing. Now he understood enough to feel it. He leaned closer and said quietly, "They actually did it." I looked at him. "We did it," I said. He gave a small smile. "That's a big we did." "Yes," I said. "That's the only kind that matters." The charter had 22 paragraphs. The last one was different. That IT contained names, not titles, not ranks, names. Peter Aldridge, Diane Ford. The 2 Keplers reached civilians, and all 31 operatives of the long patience. Every single one of them. IT said the compact existed in part because of people whose work would never be fully known, and that it would try to be worthy of that work. That I did not cry. Not then. That I had already done that. Once, late at night, the day Peter and Diane were extracted. 4 minutes, alone. Then I had gone back to work because that is what the work required. Peter was back in Bristol now. He called me once, said he was learning to bake bread. Simple things, quiet things. He said after 8 years of being someone else, he needed something real, something steady. He still did crossword puzzles on paper. Of course he did. Diane went home too. She sent one message. 2 words, "About time." That was enough. That IT fit her. The chamber slowly filled with conversation. Because after something important, people always need to talk. TO processed, TO understand, TO connect. Heron was not there. The Salari were still in review, facing questions they had never expected to answer. They were not alone. Many of the original council species were doing the same. The compact did not exclude them. But it did not protect them either. Accountability mattered now. That was the difference. As you found me during the reception, stood beside me in that careful Ethany way, close enough to show trust, far enough to show respect. "You knew," Sue said quietly, "before you replied to my message." "I had a strong idea," I said. "You knew I could be a trap." "Yes." A pause. "What made you decide?" "I thought about it." Then I answered honestly. "You chose something complicated," I said. "Old dialect. Precise structure. Not the easiest way to send a signal." Sue watched me closely. Someone setting a trap would choose something simple. I continued. "You chose something that only someone paying attention would understand." Another pause. Then Sue said softly, "That is a very human way to decide." I nodded. "It doesn't always work." "It worked this time," Sue said. "Yes," I said, "it did." We stood there for a while, watching the room, and hierarchy in controlled order. Just people figuring things out together. Messy, uncertain, but real. Later, a younger Salari delegate approached me. Careful, respectful. Nervous, he asked one question. "How long did you know?" 11 years, I said. That he was quiet. Then he asked, "Did you always believe it would work?" I shook my head. "No. We believed we had a better chance if we prepared. That's all. That's all." He nodded slowly. "You risked everything on better odds." "No," I said. "We improved the odds for 11 years. That's different." He understood that. You could see it in his face. Then he asked one last question. "What does humanity want now?" I answered simply. The same thing everyone here wants. A system where no one controls everyone else. A way to solve problems without fear. And a guarantee that what was done before never happens again. He said it was ambitious. I agreed. Because it was, but that did not make it impossible. Just difficult. And difficulty, we understood. That night, I went back to my quarters, the same small desk. Worn edges, scratches from years of use. I sat down, opened a blank page, and started writing. Not a report, not a mission log. Something else, something honest, because 2 names were written in a formal document. Informal words are not enough for real people. Peter Aldridge, Diane Ford. They deserved more than that. So I wrote the truth. The real version. The quiet version. The version with small details, crossword puzzles, long ceremonies. 90 seconds of fear. The things no official record ever includes, because those things matter. They're what actually make the difference. Yes, The Galactic Council ordered humanity wiped out. They gave us 40 cycles. They thought we would disappear quietly. They thought we would not even understand what was happening. They were wrong. Not because we were stronger. Not because we had more weapons. Not because we were better. Because we were paying attention. Because we were patient. Because when humans are afraid and they think clearly about that fear, they do not panic. They plan. They prepare. They build. They wait. And when the moment comes, they do not shout. They whisper, and if the whisper is timed right, the entire galaxy hears it.